something broke the silence. A cry, high-pitched, desperate, and unmistakably human. Her body stiffening as the cry cut through the stillness. She turned, straining her ears, disbelief clouding her thoughts. A baby. There was no mistaking it. But there hadn't been a baby in the village for months. Zola's life was simple and empty. She stood in the doorway of her small hut staring out at the endless sky. The dry wind stirred around her, but she no longer cared to listen to its whispers. Life had taught her early on that listening led to nothing but disappointment. Her parents had been taken by sickness when she was still a child, leaving her alone. The villagers had pitied her, their words branding her as an outsider, and so she learned to keep her distance. It was easier that way, safer. Silence became her companion. It was in the quiet, when the world hushed and the sun dipped below the horizon, that the weight of her loneliness pressed hardest on her. But Zola never cried. She had long since outgrown the need for tears, or for anyone. Each day blended into the next, predictable and solitary. Survival was simple, and in simplicity she found control. Love, dreams, those were for people who hadn't lost everything. But some nights, when the wind blew just right, Zola wondered if there was more to life than this hollow existence. But just as that thought settled in her mind, something broke the silence. A sound she hadn't heard in years. A cry, high-pitched, desperate, and unmistakably human. Zola's heart stuttered, her body stiffening as the cry cut through the stillness. She turned slowly, straining her ears, disbelief clouding her thoughts. A baby. There was no mistaking it. But there hadn't been a baby in the village for months. Her heart pounded in her chest as the cry came again, louder this time, pulling her from the doorway and into the bush beyond. The sound seemed to pull at something deep inside her, an unfamiliar ache, one she hadn't felt in years. Zola's feet moved instinctively, her mind racing to catch up with her body. She pushed through the tall grass, the dry stalks scratching at her arms as she followed the cries deeper into the bush. Her heart pounded, each step tightening the knot of anxiety in her chest. Why now? Why this? She didn't know, but something in her gut told her she needed to find that baby, needed to see it with her own eyes, as if proving its existence would make sense of the strange pull it had on her. The cries grew louder, more insistent, as Zola reached a small clearing. Her breath caught in her throat. There, nestled beneath a cluster of thorny branches, lay a baby, barely more than a few months old, wrapped in rags, its tiny fists waving in the air as it howled at the sky. Its face was scrunched up in frustration, and its dark skin gleamed with sweat, as if it had been crying for hours. Zola hesitated, her fingers trembling as she stepped closer. Her mind screamed for her to turn back, to leave it be. She wasn't equipped for this. She didn't want this. And yet, she couldn't look away. The baby's cries softened as she approached, its wide, teary eyes locking onto hers. Something twisted in her chest, something she hadn't expected, an overwhelming sense of recognition, of connection. It was as if, in that single glance, the baby saw her, truly saw her. Not the girl the villagers pitied, not the loner who kept everyone at arm's length, but her, beneath the layers she had built to survive, the woman who still, somewhere deep down, longed for someone to stay, someone to need her. Zola knelt down, her fingers hovering over the baby's swaddled form. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to breathe. "Who left you here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The baby's small face scrunched again, and Zola quickly reached out, pressing her palms to its tiny body as if to soothe it. "Shh, it's okay, little one." But it wasn't okay, not for her, not for this child. The last thing she needed was to get attached. She'd built her life on being alone, on controlling the predictable and guarding her heart. And yet, here she was, unable to turn away from this helpless creature. The baby let out a pitiful whimper, its tiny fist reaching out to grab at her worn tunic. Zola's chest tightened again, her pulse quickening at the sight of those delicate fingers grasping her as if she was the only thing keeping it tethered to the world. Her mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. Maybe there was someone in the village who could take the baby, someone more suited for this kind of responsibility. But the thought of handing him over to anyone else left a hollow pit in her stomach. The villagers would look at him with the same suspicion they looked at her, with disdain, with fear, as though both she and this baby were nothing more than burdens who had no parents. She couldn't let that happen. As the baby squirmed in her arms, its cries quieting to soft hiccups, Zola's thoughts drifted to the possibilities she had long since buried. She'd never allowed herself to dream of a family, of love, of anyone who might need her as much as she needed them. She had let those dreams wither, telling herself they were foolish, unattainable. But holding this baby, feeling its warmth against her chest, stirred something in her she thought was long dead. A tiny spark of hope, faint but persistent, flickered to life in her heart. Zola took a deep breath, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Fine," she muttered, as if negotiating with herself. "I'll take care of you, for now. Just until I figure this out." The baby's head rested against her chest, its small body relaxing into her arms as if, for the first time, it felt safe. Zola stood, adjusting the weight of the baby against her hip. It had been so long since she had held another living soul, and the warmth of this small life against hers sent a shiver down her spine. She glanced back toward the village, where she knew the others would disapprove. They already kept their distance, whispering behind her back, treating her like an outsider. What would they say now, seeing her with a baby? But for the first time, Zola didn't care. Let them talk. Let them spread their rumors. She had made her choice. Turning away from the village, Zola began the long walk back to her hut, her heart beating in time with the baby's soft breaths. It didn't take long for Zola to realize something was terribly wrong. At first, she tried to dismiss it. Babies were supposed to cry, weren't they? But Mandla, as she had named him, cried like the world itself was falling apart. His screams pierced through the walls of her small hut, echoing through the village in the dead of night, sharp and relentless. Zola would sit by his side, trying everything she could to calm him, whispering soothing words, rocking him in her arms until her muscles burned. But nothing worked. His cries were more than just cries. They were miserable, raw, and desperate, as if something inside him was broken, and he didn't know how to fix it. Zola had never been around babies before, but even she knew that this wasn't normal. The baby's wails felt as if they clawed at her insides, unraveling her carefully constructed walls. He would throw tantrums, flailing his tiny fists and kicking his legs, refusing to be held, to be fed, to be soothed. It was as though he was fighting her, fighting the world. What she didn't realize until it was too late was that Mandla was growing. It happened so subtly at first that she hadn't noticed. Days bled into nights and the baby seemed heavier in her arms, bulkier, but she chalked it up to her own exhaustion. But soon, there was no denying it. He was bigger. His tiny clothes were now stretched tight against his chubby limbs, and Zola found herself unable to cradle him in the crook of her arm the way she used to. She stared at him in disbelief one evening, watching as Mandla's fists clenched in frustration, his body unnaturally large for a baby his age. His face was still round and cherubic, but his body, his limbs, they were growing too fast, too large. "What's happening to you?" she whispered, fear snaking its way into her chest. She tried to feed him, but he knocked the bowl of porridge away, sending it crashing to the floor. Zola winced as the sound echoed in her tiny hut, her heart pounding. Outside, the villagers had begun to notice too. They had tolerated Zola's strangeness over the years, whispering behind her back but keeping their distance. But now they whispered with more urgency. There were rumors, dark murmurs about the baby that had appeared out of nowhere. His cries, so loud and unnatural, disturbed the village's peaceful nights, and his growth, impossible, rapid, fueled their suspicions. The knocking came one morning, sharp and insistent. Zola had barely slept, her nerves frayed from another long night of Mandla's relentless screaming. She opened the door to find a crowd of villagers, their faces hard and unforgiving. Elder Makizi, a tall, stern woman with deep lines etched into her face, stepped forward. "Zola," she said, her voice heavy with accusation, "this child you've brought into the village, it is cursed." Zola felt her heart stop. "What? No, he's just a baby." "A cursed baby," one of the men in the crowd spat. "We've heard his cries. He doesn't sound like a child. He sounds like a demon." "Look at him," another woman chimed in, pointing at Mandla, who sat on the floor, his body far too large for his age, his eyes filled with a strange, unnatural misery. "That thing is no normal baby. It grows like a weed, and its cries keep us awake night after night." "He's just different," Zola tried to explain, her voice trembling. "But he's not cursed. She didn't know how to finish the sentence because, truthfully, she didn't know what was wrong. The rapid growth, the endless crying, the way Mandla seemed to resist everything she did for him, it terrified her. But the idea of letting these villagers who had never cared for her label him as cursed and take him away, that terrified her even more. Elder Makizi shook her head. "This is the way of things, Zola. We cannot risk the safety of the village for you and your cursed child. He does not belong here." Zola's chest tightened, panic rising in her throat. "You can't just throw us out. Where will we go?" "The jungle," Elder Makizi said simply. "You came from the bush. It is only fitting you return to it. Take the child far away from here. It is the only way to keep the village safe." Zola's hands shook as she glanced back at Mandla, who had now crawled to the edge of the room, his miserable cries beginning to build once more like a storm on the horizon. He was growing too big, too fast. Soon she wouldn't be able to lift him. Soon he'd be too large to even fit in her home. The villagers weren't wrong to be afraid. But what about her? What was she supposed to do, alone in the wilderness with this strange, miserable baby that she didn't understand but couldn't abandon? "No," Zola whispered, her voice cracking. I can't leave. I don't know how to live out there away from the village. I don't know how to survive like that. Please don't send me away." But the villagers' faces remained stone, unmoved by her desperation. "You have until tomorrow," Elder Makizi said coldly, turning her back on Zola. "Leave, or we will make you." Zola stood frozen, staring at their retreating forms, her breath shallow as fear wrapped itself around her chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had kept her life small, simple, predictable, so that she could control it, so that nothing could hurt her again. And now, this. She turned back to Mandla, who let out another wail, his face contorted in that same expression of misery that had plagued him since the moment she found him. He had grown again, his limbs now too large for her to carry without strain, his cries too loud to silence. Her hands trembled as she knelt beside him, brushing a tear from her eye. "What am I going to do with you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. He stared at her, wide-eyed, his small fists curling into the dirt, babbling incoherently through his tears. Zola felt something inside her break. She had no idea what she was doing, no idea how to protect them both from the fate that awaited them outside the village. But what choice did she have? She couldn't leave him behind. The following morning, the villagers gathered again, their eyes cold and expectant as they watched Zola pack her few belongings into a worn bag. She felt their gaze burning into her back as she lifted Mandla, now so large she could barely hold him, onto her hip, his bulk pressing against her chest like a weight she couldn't escape. She stepped toward the jungle, her heart pounding in her chest, every step feeling like a step into the unknown, into something she wasn't sure she could survive. But as the trees loomed ahead of her, dark and unwelcoming, Zola clenched her jaw. She didn't know how she was going to do this. She didn't know how she was going to protect him, how she was going to keep them both alive, but she would. Somehow she would. Because even though he was a miserable baby, even though she didn't understand him, she had made a choice. She wouldn't abandon him, not like everyone had abandoned her. The jungle was nothing like Zola had imagined. It was darker, more alive, and more threatening than anything she had ever known. The air was thick and oppressive, carrying the scent of damp earth and rotting vegetation. Shadows moved in the trees, and every crack of a branch sent a shiver down her spine. The jungle seemed to breathe around them, alive with its own hidden dangers, whispering promises of hardship and fear. Mandla had grown again. He was now so large, his body sprawled across the forest floor, his enormous limbs tangled in the underbrush. His cries, though slightly less frequent, were no less miserable. The baby, if she could still call him that, was now the size of a small hut, and his booming wails echoed through the trees, causing flocks of birds to scatter in fright. Zola sat beside him, exhausted and trembling, her muscles aching from days of struggle. She had tried, time and time again, to build a shelter large enough to cover his massive body, but everything she made collapsed under his weight or was torn apart by the wind. She had crafted crude shelters for herself, using branches and palm fronds to keep the rain off her skin, but Mandla was too big. She couldn't carry him, couldn't drag him. He was rooted to the ground like an immovable mountain. The baby, once small and fragile in her arms, had become a looming, helpless giant, and Zola felt her fear growing with every passing hour. "Mandla," she whispered, her voice tight with exhaustion. "What are you? What am I supposed to do with you?" He responded with a low whimper, his enormous chest rising and falling with each pitiful breath. His eyes, too large for his face now, seemed to flicker with sadness, as if he understood, on some level, the impossibility of their situation. Zola clenched her fists, fighting back the urge to scream at the injustice of it all. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't asked for him. And now, here they were, alone in the jungle, abandoned by the village, by the world. She was supposed to be strong, supposed to handle this, but the weight of it, of him, was crushing her. Her hands trembled as she crouched beside him, brushing the damp leaves from his swollen cheeks. "Shh. Please, Mandla," she murmured, her voice breaking. "Just sleep. Just rest for a little while. I don't know how much more of this I can take." He whimpered again, his cries quieting, but his eyes remained open, locked on hers with a strange, haunting intensity. It was as if he were begging her for something she couldn't give him, because she didn't even know what he needed. The night had fallen heavy around them, the dark thick and all-encompassing. Somewhere in the distance, a low growl echoed through the trees, and Zola stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. Lions. They had been circling for hours now, their predatory instincts awakened by the scent of the helpless giant in their midst. Zola had kept the fire burning, feeding it with every scrap of wood she could find, but she knew it wasn't enough. The jungle's predators were relentless, their eyes glowing in the shadows just beyond the firelight. Zola sat beside Mandla's massive form, her heart pounding in her chest as the growls grew closer. She could feel the wild eyes watching them from the darkness, waiting for the fire to weaken for a moment when they could strike. She glanced at the baby, now an impossible size, his body far too large for her to protect. He was vulnerable, exposed, and yet so miserable that even now, even with the threat of death looming, he was still whimpering in his sleep, still restless, still impossible to soothe. Panic clawed at Zola's mind. How was she supposed to protect him? How was she supposed to keep them safe? She was just one girl, alone in a jungle that wanted to devour them both. For the briefest moment, the thought flickered in her mind. Run. She could leave him here. He was too big, too much trouble, too impossible to care for. He was drawing danger to them both with his size, his cries. If she ran now, if she left him to fend for himself, she might be able to survive. She could slip into the shadows, hide from the lions, and find her way back to the village. Maybe she could convince them to let her return if she came back alone. The thought horrified her. She stared at Mandla's giant form, tears welling in her eyes as she considered the possibility. Could she really leave him? Could she really abandon him here, helpless and alone? He had no one else, just like she had no one else. Zola's heart twisted painfully in her chest as she remembered the way she had felt when the village had turned its back on her, when they had cast her out without a second thought. She had known loneliness all her life, known what it felt like to be unwanted, to be an outsider. And now, here was Mandla, a creature who had only ever known misery, who couldn't understand why the world seemed to hate him for what he was. "No," Zola whispered, her voice shaking. I won't leave you.